redlined copy, of course. It effectively streamlines. We adopted, if not all, the vast majority of the textual edits that Ms. Allen had recommended to streamline and clean up the language. We were asked to make the policy more concise where possible, and in the process of doing that, we struck the restorative practice definition because we realized that the term restorative practice is not used anywhere else in the policy. So we don't need a definition for a term that's not used. We were also asked to remove references to philosophy. So you'll see on page 1 in A1, philosophy is struck. On page 3 in C1 and C3, you'll see philosophy and believe, which is, in our mind was related. And then on page 5 in D5A, the word philosophy was also replaced there. And so those were the changes that were requested and made. And so at this point, unless there's more discussion to be had, I think this policy is ready to be advanced forward to the board for a first reading.
I really appreciate Ms. Allen's recommendation and incorporation policy, because I think it streamlines those. Number 1 and number 2.
Yeah, I appreciate the work that you did. It was good.
Yeah, I love it. Instead of saying we believe or philosophy, it says we do.
Action words, I think
Like
are
it.
important.
Very good.
Okay. So, everyone good? Moving it forward to the board.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So the next policy is policy 408, suspension and expulsion, and this is the corresponding decommission because the content of 408 was folded into 403. So there's really no discussion needed since 403 has been approved. Unless there's a reason not to decommission 408, we can advance this to the board for our first reading as well. Okay. So the next item is policy 440, charter schools, and we did bring charter schools originally to the policy committee on March 27th for a conversation. Now you're going to see the actual edits that we've started to make. We did not include a summary of the edits because they were extensive, and we decided that before we prepare the summary for the board, we wanted to make sure we had all the edits completed. So in this one instance, we're going to create that summary before the first reading. We did not create the summary as part of this packet of materials. You will see throughout, and we tried to annotate where we could, that a lot of what we have done here is just struck language that belongs in the regulation, or struck language altogether that didn't belong, period, because it was not consistent with current practices, or we relocated language into different spaces in the same document. I can walk you through it. Do we have? No. If I need help, I know I have I have my phone a friend if I need it, but I think I can walk you through it if you'd like me to do that. All right, so we start at the top. We are establishing what the policy purpose is in section A, and that is to articulate what the expectations are for submission and evaluation of proposals for public charter schools and the oversight of those charter schools. We have created definitions for application, charter, or charter contract, or contract, which are all the different versions of the same. The charter school governing board for concept proposal. There was originally a definition for eligible public charter school, but we are moving that into the regulation. We don't feel it needs to be defined here because we have a definition for public charter school or charter school that immediately follows it. Now, I will tell you that this paragraph 5 definition, public charter school, we have a number of sub-paragraphs there, and we are taking another look at this paragraph to see if we need all or any of those sub-paragraphs. So I would expect either in the version that gets advanced to the board, or if it comes back to policy committee, that this definition is going to look a little different in the next iteration of this document. And then the last 3 definitions, renewal review team, and revocation. In the policy statement, we have taken out the reference to the national movement. This is Frederick County. We are not national. We are unique and individual and our own very special place. So we felt taking that language out was appropriate. In part, also just we want to streamline this and make this a clean, concise document. We are establishing very clearly that the board supports the Maryland law that vests the authority to establish charters, but we are moving the remainder of that paragraph into its own section later. The board's recognizing what the purpose of the charter school is, and that's to establish an alternative means for education. We do relocate some of the language from C2, and there we've even given you the reference to the Public School Charter Improvement Act of 2015, which is where that seems to come from. We have moved from what would have been a later section into policy statement 4, that it is the board's expectation that the public school charter operators will recruit and target all segments of the community and strive to have a representative student population. And then the changes in section 5 are just textual, correcting the citation to the Maryland Annotated Code the way we've been doing it. It is in the implementation section where you're going to see the large bulk of the changes that are made. We start off with a very clear articulation. The board is the only entity that can authorize a charter in Frederick County. No one else has that authority. And then there's a similarly clear statement that here is what the superintendent's role will be, to oversee the charters and make recommendations to the board. The third implementation piece is that the board's responsibility is to ensure that prior to opening a public charter school, that the operators of the charter school are provided certain information. They need to know what the expectations are with respect to human, fiscal, and organizational capacity in order to meet the responsibilities, in particular related to children with disabilities. Now, the criteria section that was 440.3 is all gone. It is all going to be moved into regulation. The board is still going to articulate as part of its policy, however, what it will not do with respect to a charter. So the community knows we will not have a charter school that is a private school, that is a parochial school or a home school, a school that operates fully online, or any school whose operation would be inconsistent with public policy initiatives, court or federal improvement plans governing special education applicable to Maryland. So the first 4, A, B, C, D, were already in the policy. It's just relocated, and E is an addition based on Maryland Education Code. The application process, paragraph 5, is all being removed and relocated to regulation, as is the appeal process. There's really no change in 7. Again, that's just a textual reference to the statutory provision. 8 is exactly the same. The educational programs and services, which were 440.5, moved to regulation. The student outcomes in 440.6 moved to regulation. The student admission and tuition policy, piece of the policy. This is a mixed bag. We're keeping some of it in policy and moving the rest of it to elsewhere in the document or into regulations. The long and short of it is we are maintaining that students are residing in Frederick County. They have to be eligible for admittance without tuition charge. That they will have priority over out-of-county students, that the charter school will adhere to the special education needs and 504 needs of our students, that we will not allow the charter to deny based on any illegal discriminatory basis. Those all remain as part of the board's statement of what is important to them. Paragraph 12 deals with employees of public charters, and again, there is one section, section C, that is being moved into the regulation. The FCPS employees assigned to work in a charter school will be observed and evaluated consistent with state law and FCPS procedure. That is really teacher evaluation, which is superintendent's responsibility. So we felt that belonged in the regulation. And then the certification requirement actually doesn't really belong anywhere because that's governed by contract. The management plan for the schools is moved to the regulation. The facilities information that's deleted from now paragraph 14, it used to be 440.10. So it's the struck through paragraphs C and D. Those are being moved into regulation. Consistent theme here. A lot of pulling out of this policy, things that really did not belong. The financial plan for the school also moved to regulation. The transportation needs are going to be moved to either Regulation 487 or to a new regulation. I think that is still being determined by our staff. The renewal process is brought up to date to be more current with the practices that are in place. The eligible public charter school information, that very long section, it spans a couple of pages, all moved into regulation. The charter school renewal program review, all moved into regulation. I feel like a broken record in some ways. And all of this review timeline, all of this is going to be relocated into the regulation. And I will take a quick moment to tell you that Dr. Alavito's team, Danny Enck, they have been working very hard on the regulation. We have been coordinating with them, so we know that this is in process. And it is going to be ready to roll as soon as the policy is updated as well. The probation review, that there are minor textual edits there, and then pieces of it that are, again, moved to regulation. And that's really what the policy, what we've been doing with the policy. So, as I said, we're still looking at that that one definition. There are things in there that I think are probably not needed to be referenced there. So, for example, in the definition, we say that they are subject to federal and state laws, including those prohibiting discrimination. Well, later in the implementation, we say you cannot discriminate in the selection of your students. So why do we need it in both places? And so that's what we're taking another look at to make sure that that definition is cleaner and more concise. And so I stand open for questions.
I have a question. So for the length of contract, the charter may be granted for up to 5 years. Is there anywhere in there, is that going to be in the regulation or in here about renewal or extending the contract? How that process?
Sure. So the length of contract is the policy is a policy statement that belongs here, and that is the board's board's prerogative. There's so much red line, it's hard to keep track of.
Thank you.
It
a little challenge. I was trying to find it. And I was like, no, I'm just going to
It is
ask.
right under provisions for renewal, which is 19.
The process for the renewal is moving into the regulation. The only thing, and there is a provision for renewal that says when it's time for, the board is setting, here's when it's time to renew, and then the regulation is going to tell you how to do it.
There it is. Never mind. Okay.
Yep. It's a big policy in terms of just the sheer volume of it, and it will be a lot different when we finalize it into a much shorter version.
That's a lot of work. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I do have a question about my question is about funding and what the financial relationship is between FCPS and charters, and particularly this has come up as we're talking about the requirements around Blueprint and how we fund and support charters versus traditional schools within FCPS. Would it be appropriate to have anything in this policy that makes any statements around that, the financial fiscal responsibility of FCPS? Or is it a reference to the law?
I would hesitate to put something in the policy that speaks to the fiscal, because as we've seen over the past year, the fiscal, the options that are available to the board have changed. There was the state board's decision that altered how Baltimore City, didn't alter it. It affirmed that Baltimore City's change in approach was consistent with the Blueprint and the other state funding requirements. There was so much litigation over that in the Baltimore City context, and now every other LEA is wrestling with the same question. I would hesitate to put anything that binds the board to a particular method or practice in terms of how you make the choice to allocate funding. From year to year, we don't know what the budget needs are going to be. We can forecast in the future, and we know that the forecast, doesn't look necessarily great unless something, important changes. And to tie us down into some kind of funding structure or some kind of funding statement, Anything more than saying we will fund this charters in consistent with Maryland law, I mean, it would need to be that broad of a statement for it to be, and at that point, is it even a meaningful statement? Because obviously, we're going to fund it in accordance with Maryland law.
I'm thinking, and I don't know for sure, but maybe you can confirm, that those financial terms are defined within the contract,
Within the charter agreement.
within the charter agreement, right? The charter contract. I feel like I read that somewhere in one of their agreements. But I haven't been, involved in the process of bringing on a charter or even at the renewal of a charter.
So I will admit that it's been more than a minute since I last looked at one of our charter agreements. Probably was back in the fall was the last time I looked at one. I don't have a recollection off the top of my head. Dr. Alavito, do you know if the charter agreements speak to that? I'm gonna use my phone a friend.
Well, and I don't know that I have a definitive answer, other than I know it's typically based on the per pupil cost. And so in our charters, what's important is that they say how many students they'll serve, because that's how we fund all of our schools, based on per pupil expenditures. Outside of that, we might even have to just go to Maryland law for the extent to which they define that.
Then if we reference that, you know what I'm saying, in this policy, as in make it a reference point as one of the externals that, because I do know that it is in the Maryland law, that it defines how we are to fund the charter schools. Unless you already have it here, and I'm just not.
I don't think we have a statement specifically with respect to funding.
I'm just saying that if we used it as an external resource.
Oh.
they could click on so that if somebody had a question about that, then they could go to the Maryland law. So to understand what the funding formula is.
Yeah, I don't think.
I don't remember either when reading the contract, whether it was defined in there or not.
Just, as we've been talking about the budget, and obviously this has come up as a concern, just something
No, I agree.
to consider, whether it is just simply a link in our resources. I think that the discussion has raised a lot of questions from our parents, in particular, charter school students. Consider, but I agree that we don't necessarily want to tie ourselves to one particular statement, because the law is evolving and always is evolving. Just one other note, under the FCPS resources, it looks like we have links to all those links. Are those supposed to be links? Web pages for,
We don't have civilians.
right, Sibylla's.
Oh, we're missing Sibylla's.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was my note, that we're missing Sibylla's, but also those aren't. They're supposed to be, at least when I click it.
No, they're not links now, but we will make sure that they're links.
I do think if you go to the charter school, they do have their contract on there.
They probably do. They're sometimes kind of buried. You have to navigate through the menus to make your way to them. They're not, full front facing, which makes sense because the focus should be on, what they're doing for the children, not necessarily the governing documents.
I don't know if this belongs in the policy or whether it belongs in the regulation, but I did have somebody question to me, what is the chain of authority? And my thought was, it's their board of trustees governs the charter school, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
And then their board reports to us.
Correct.
Correct.
That was actually feedback that we got. Mr. Eng and Mr. Fritz pulled together the charter boards and charter principals, and much of their feedback was on how language will present in the regulation.
Okay.
And they talked about things like the evaluation of the principal and the head of school, what that looks like. with joint feedback. They talked about clarity in the relationship between the board, the principal, and our board,
Okay.
and the FCPS in general. So those are things that I hope we'll be able to flush out a bit in the regulation.
Are you addressing at all in the regulations, Open Meetings Act and compliance with, you know, when they hold their board meetings? Not that they aren't already doing that, but, you know, it's interesting, sitting on the Park and Rec Commission, that's been brought forward. Frederick County just did kind of an overview of all of their meeting protocols and their bylaws with all of their commissions and their committees and task force. And yeah, so that was kind of a refresher, you know, for the commission, which was good, you know, but, and not that they weren't in compliance, but it was just like, oh, okay, well, you know, handling public comment was brought up and so forth. So there were some updates that were beneficial for the discussion about how the meetings are conducted.
Just had just a clarification on code on, what is it, D4, page 4. Just clarification that it's in code that a school that operates fully online is not eligible for a charter.
That is my recollection. I'd have to go back and verify just to be 100% certain, but my recollection is yes, those are listed in the Maryland Code as expressly ineligible to be a charter.
Okay. And in all this, I can't find it again, but there was a section referencing transportation.
There was a section referencing transportation. It is on page 9, 9 of 18 at the very top. It was 440-12 or .12, but that will be moved into a regulation.
And so my question is, are there any, do you know of any situations in which we're providing transportation for our charter schools?
Just for special education students.
Mhm.
I'm not aware of any other regular transportation.
I just wonder if that's like, because this, like if that's going to be moved to regulation, but the second line of that says, if conducive to currently established bus routes, that we might. I just wonder if we evaluate that each year.
That would be a question for Dr. Lebo. I don't know the answer to that. But I mean, I do know that we're not providing transportation other than for special education students.
I only ask that from an equity perspective.
Oh, yeah.
If we have kids that apply to the charter, they get accepted, as we all know, transportation is a problem. If we evaluated it each year and determined that, wow, we have a bus that goes right by there, and
Right.
we have 10 seats on it or whatever, I just wonder if we take a look at that each year.
We can follow up with Dr. Lebo about that.
Thank you.
And then, you know, I also, now that at least one of our charters is expanding into high school, I could envision, you know, I don't know whether we would be looking at providing transportation for extracurricular athletics. I don't know. I don't know if we've discussed that or if that's been raised by the charters with us.
They already currently have the cross country. It didn't come up this year for transportation. But I know like career, CTC, they expand forward CTC, FCC options. That's all starting to be discussed in Knox Valley Montessori as they advance to 10th grade next year.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, so there's definitely, you know, areas where we need to probably give some more thought and consideration as to what language and where it would live.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
So in the contract, and this is for FCCS, it does talk about fiscal matters and services,
Mhm.
but it does reference that the formula is based on law. What the current law is. And then also in the board policy.
It does reference board policy.
It does reference board policy 440. Yeah. section 1.2.
Which is probably something different now. Once we take it
I think it's 1.2 or 5.2.
I wonder if it would be, therefore, I wonder if it would be appropriate for us to reference that same law somewhere in the policy under here where we have financial responsibility. I can't remember what the exact title of the,
Mhm.
but I just wonder if it would be appropriate for us to also reference a link to that same law.
I would want to just, I mean, I'm sure it is, but I would want to just verify that the language is consistent across all the charters.
Yeah.
And so we're not creating some, by adding that into our policy, that we're not creating some kind of inconsistency with the charter agreement.
But that will be something that will need to be updated, I guess, once they renew.
So it seems like we do have some edits to make. Is this something that the panel is comfortable pushing forward to the board, or do you want this back on the July 26th policy committee meeting with those revisions? I mean, we're talking about the changes in the definition, adding Sibyllsville and making the charter school pages links, and adding references to the funding statute. And then if, well, the transportation, we're going to look into. I don't know whether the transportation will,
Whether it needs any expansion or
Right.
language.
or whether it's just,
Most of that's, well, all of that entire paragraph's being moved to regulation.
Right.
So.
What do you think? Do you think that we need to look at it again before the board or wait for the board? You know, I suspect that the board will probably set it back policy.
I think let's look
it's
at
gonna
it
come
one
back
more
to us
time
anyways.
here, and then,
Is there a concern among staff that we need to expedite, or is there any concern about getting this done prior to the start of next?
So we have a school up for renewal, and the timeline and the details of the renewal will go in the regulation. We're kind of in a spot where we can't be definitive about the regulation until we know where the board is with policy. It might be nice if the whole board could give a nod to the direction in which we're heading. And we're doing all of the collaboration at the same time. So they're not going to be surprised by anything. They're giving us feedback about what they want to see. So I think we'll be okay, but the timeline will start for that school September 1st.
Well, if it's all right with everybody else, why don't we send it to the board for first reading with the recognition that it may well be sent back to us.
Yeah.
Right.
But let's get that board input, full board input.
So just know if we're on the right track.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because like you said, I think that'll be important for regulation creation.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Libby.
Thanks for the discussion.
So the next item on the agenda is policy 414, field trips and overnight travel study programs. This we are it's listed as information discussion action. It's really only information discussion. We don't have any proposed changes. We really are more interested in hearing what the panel might think needs to be adjusted, other than bringing it, any changes that we have to make to bring it current to COMAR, obviously we have to make. But looking to see if there's anything that the board or this panel is interested in with respect to these policies or this policy, so staff can start to make the appropriate draft edits.
Do we do any overnights now at all? Like, I know when I was in school, we did Marley Ridge.
I'm going to use my next phone a friend.
The outdoor school is, I thought, a day program now, not necessarily as.
So we do some overnight trips. They're in high school primarily, and they're like associated with band, typically going to like Orlando, typically non-school days. And that's part of the policy. So there are overnight trips that are happening, and partially theater. Yeah. So very much in high school, it typically is for them to have an experience with professionals that are doing whatever the particular task is. There are exceptions though in middle school. My first couple of years here, this is probably back in 2014, There was Urbana Middle School was recognized for their band program, and we were invited to Chicago. And it also provides an opportunity for a school for a special situation, and we actually allowed the students to travel to Chicago to participate in this recognition. So very rarely middle school, but I wouldn't say never.
Okay, all right. Well, that's good to know. Thank you.
And I've invited Mr. Fritz up to join us because I think he's got some more information to
Well, I
share.
just want to share about the Montessori public charter schools. Part of their programming, they call it going out, but it's field trips. They do several overnight trips with their middle schoolers. So Carroll Creek Montessori, they have a 6th grade trip coming up, and then they also have an 8th grade trip coming up. So it's part of their regular programming. It's not really part of our traditional school programming, but I just wanted to share that. It's important
Yeah.
for their programming. So.
Oh, no, I don't see any immediate changes made other than what we indicated.
Yeah, just confirming that there's no changes in COMAR that would require update.
And currently, we have a work group that's working on the regulation, because the regulation similarly hasn't been updated since, I don't know the exact date, but around the
It's in reference to
2006.
regulation in that, so-
Right, so we have a group that's working on it, and it's a cross-disciplinary group, high school teachers, middle school teachers, elementary school teachers, FCTA. And we were given a charge by Dr. Alavito to bring it in alignment with our welcoming and affirming policy because of transgender students, and especially on overnight trips. So being
How is
sensitive.
that gonna be handled?
So it's in the regulation proposal right now, and it follows the affirming policy, because the policy actually details what should be happening. So that is something that we're working on currently. So it's not currently in alignment with that 443. So that's part of our work, is to make sure the regulation is in alignment.
So we don't really have any say into that regulation, do we? Giving direction to that?
The regulation is the purview of the superintendent. It is guided by what is in policy. I mean, it is the policy, as we've said, the policy is the what, and the regulation is the how. And it's your all purview to decide the what, and the superintendent's responsibility to figure out the how.
I did, and it's just a general discussion since you are here. I did have a question around the financial perspective of field trips. Because I have heard this from certain schools that, oh, Oakdale gets to go here and Catoctin doesn't because of the funding situation. Are there discussions about our equity within our schools? Because in particular, I was reading the one paragraph here where it says that financial will not be a reason to exclude a student from a trip. If the school funds are not available to support the student, the trip shall not occur. So, if they have a student that needs a waiver or,
Sure.
scholarship, that may exclude the school
Yeah.
from having the field trip.
So there's a lot of complications when it comes to elective field trips. A lot of it is about the teacher and their desire to do the work necessary to do a trip, right? Because it's not a requirement. There are required trips that are free. So our band adjudications, for example, where a kid is participating in a program that is part of, the program is to have an opportunity to judge yourselves against other schools in the similar grade level. Those are free. But the first piece is that maybe some of the differences is that teachers get to decide if they're going to go based on, I'm social studies, so they want to go to Philadelphia in response to supporting, the studies of American history. That is not a requirement, but a teacher could elect to do that. And then that's part of the regulation. They go through and plan it and et cetera. If it is a voluntary trip, a student would then be offered, if they were not interested in going, they would have the opportunity to have an equivalent activity in school. I know no principal that would deny somebody based on financial, even if it's an elective trip, to go on a trip. But there are times where kids decide not to go, or a parent decides, I don't want my child to go Examples might be that that is the sports championship.
Mhm.
And that happens at 6 o'clock that night and the bus may not get back to the school until 7. So those are kind of examples where potentially a student wouldn't go, but it wouldn't because of financial. Dr. Alavito popped up, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to assure the board that that is where we rely on oftentimes our booster partners as well as our student activity funds. Every school has student activity funds, and I have never heard of a case in 6 years where a student was denied the ability to go because of finances. We would always cover that. And I have no concern knowing those accounts that we couldn't cover it.
So you're confident that a school would not cancel a trip without
Absolutely.
going through the process of seeing if they can't get that student scholarship to go?
Absolutely, and I agree with Mr. Saunders. It's often about what the staff at that school lean towards in the way of a field trip, what that community's used to. And I think that's where you see the variance.
And I wonder if there are any discussions within staff about working with our local nonprofits about possibly funding these types. It seems like this, just in my experience, it seems like something that would be right up the alley of the Osherman Foundation, the Delaplane Foundation, the Community Foundation, to look at, would they pitch in an account that might scholarship kids that might otherwise not be able to go? Is there discussions about bringing in partners like that?
So we have a tremendous partnership with many of the folks that you've mentioned. I would say it would depend on if we felt it was a need. And I think what I'm sharing with you is it hasn't been a need because of student activity funds, as well as our partnerships with our booster organizations. High school is often where you get the more costly trips, and that's where we have kind of robust booster partners, and then student activity funds are available at every school.
And if there is a specific case, let me know, because certainly that would be something in my office we would look into, because that should not be a reason a student would be denied participation.
And we're pretty passionate about that.
Sure.
Correct.
Absolutely. And
Because-
I just look at it as another alternative funding source as well. If we talk to our partners, our nonprofit partners, that they might say, wow, that would be something we'd really like
They
to
would.
Right.
get involved with. So I just wonder if that's another
Yeah.
alternative source.
And we have, I can think of times we've partnered with Community Foundation where they funded other initiatives. Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
great, thank you.
Good question.
I have a question for you. When you were asking your initial question, you talked about, Oakdale was gonna do this trip, but Catoctin wasn't going. Were you talking more, and I 100% agree with everything you all said. We support, I'm in all the booster organizations, and I was just talking to a parent the other day whose second child was discussing maybe not joining marching band because they weren't gonna have the money for both. And I was like, no, that's what we're here for. Like, we are the boosters. We put that into the budget. Their money will not keep you from playing music or a sport or whatever you're gonna do. That's what we're here for. But what I heard in your initial question was more about school to school.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, we all hear the it's the rumor thing,
Sure.
why didn't Catoctin get to go to the Smithsonian? Why, like that. So I just want to make sure that our communication among our high schools is that we look for equity among all of our schools in order to take advantage of opportunities to go on field trips.
We have to keep in mind that the field trips are not a system-wide program. They're done at the school level, even as Mr. Saunders said, down to the teacher level. And so there's necessarily going to be variance because, one teacher might say, one American history teacher might say, you know what, I think going to Philadelphia and the Liberty Bell is important. And another might say, I want to go to take the kids to Colonial Williamsburg. Two very equal experiences in terms of the educational value for that subject, but two very different trips.
Yeah, I guess that goes back, that just kind of goes to transparency, that so that families and parents understand that we're not excluding,
Mhm.
we're actually including.
Mhm.
That teachers have the opportunity to pick and choose what might be appropriate for their curriculum, that type of thing. So when they do look, when the kid comes home and says, oh my God, my friend at Oakdale got to go to,
Right.
and then a rumor starts that we didn't get to go. It's not they didn't get to go, it just wasn't proposed.
Right. And I could certainly envision a scenario where one teacher said, look, we're in Maryland. There are a lot of historical sites of importance right down the road, Monocacy Battlefield, right? And, there's very little cost to visiting Monocacy Battlefield or a short drive up to Gettysburg versus a longer trip. But the perception
Yes.
that coming out of that would look like, well, one's doing something that, doesn't have any cost, and the other's you spending money because they can to go on a more,
That's exactly what I'm talking
exactly,
about, the perception
extravagant trip.
over reality.
Along those same lines, I would say we're talking about a really large high school, and then we're talking about, 2 or 3 of our really smaller schools filling up a bus. You talked about the booster trip to Orlando, which is exactly what I'm planning in February. Super excited, but paying attention to, we have 53 seats on this bus, and if we go over to another bus, it's this much more per kid. So when you're planning, so we're gonna be really tight on that bus, but when you're planning a trip for a school, if you have a certain number of kids, if you can fill that whole bus, whether it's a school bus or if you have to get a charter, that's one cost. But if you have a few more, or if you can only fill half a charter bus, that's where your equity issues come into play, where your opportunities are a little bit different, and also where you're located. Because, if you're up in Catoctin, you're a lot further from Washington, D.C., than Urbana is. So all of those things kind of, it's hard to make it equal across the board, but I feel like from a size of a school perspective, that's sort of where we run into some issues too.
Would you want to look at some language, different language there under D1 instead of, the statement that says if school funds are not available to support students with financial problems, the trip shall not occur? Maybe just removing that language, because it sounds
mean,
like that's
yeah,
not the process. It doesn't sound like we stop the trip from happening. We try to work it out so it does happen for everyone.
I would like to see something in the policy that we would support the student, rather than canceling the trip. We have support in place to support a
Yeah.
student that may not.
Through
be able to
partnerships or
To
whatever,
rework that sentence.
we would ever explore all avenues to ensure that the trip occurs.
I like that.
More complicated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Instead of it's out.
Something more affirming than negative.
Yes.
Cancel, we're not gonna cancel, we're bringing you with us.
That's
And let
right.
it reflect what's actually happening.
Yes,
Right.
Well, and look, I mean, this policy last was looked at in 2006. I mean, that's part of why we're pushing through with these.
Maybe at that time, they looked at that as we're gonna be equitable, if one can't go, the other can't go.
Right.
Yeah. Let's be more affirming and saying, no, let's make it happen.
And so if we don't have any other, thoughts for the board, I think, Mr. Saunders has some feedback, and we'll work on getting this ready for the June 26th board meeting for presentation of edits, or policy committee meeting, not board meeting.
Great. Thank you all.
Jamie, you might as well just stay.
She's trying to get her steps in.
No, really. Frank and Jamie, do you want to come? So the next item is policy. The next one is policy 416. This is progress reporting. We do have a red line version, so there are some proposed edits, and it looks more blue than red because the original policy didn't say a whole lot. And I am actually going to just let Dr. Vetter lead the conversation.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So really, this policy hasn't been updated since 2006, and sort of the major change really is technology. Parents have the opportunity to have greater agency than just contacting the school to find out how their kids are doing, because we have an electronic gradebook system. And so that's a significant change. We also just wanted to point out that various assessment data are distributed to families regularly. For example, the state produces a report to send home MCAP results that we distribute with report cards. Some of our local assessments that we use, such as our DIBEL screener for foundational reading skills, reports are sent home to families. So we just wanted to mention that there is another way that we're communicating with families about progress of their students.
So you want to just walk them through? You have an older version, I think. Because we've added definition. All right, so we'll just walk you through it very quickly. It shouldn't take too long. The policy purpose is there to just to articulate the expectations regarding communications with parents. We have a definition of parent that it includes biological, adoptive, custodian, guardian, caregiver, foster parent. It just helps us to capture all of the potential, individuals who might be responsible for a child into a single term. And then I think the changes that you see in the policy statement really are reflective of the changes that Dr. Vetter was just discussing, the availability of technology. In the implementation, there's the addition of the reference to the assessment results, which again, Dr. Vetter referenced. And then addition of COMAR requirements and what the expectation in COMAR is for information that the principal will share with families. It's relatively straightforward. Maybe I didn't need you, Dr. Alavito.
You didn't need me.
You did great.
Are there any questions or concerns about this policy?
So I know that there's a difference between the interaction with teachers and parents at the elementary, middle, and high school level. So I know that there are required, right, teacher-parent conferences that happen on the elementary and the middle school level, but are no longer required at the high school level, correct? Is there something, do we want to speak to that in this policy? Or is that something that belongs in a companion regulation? Is there a companion regulation to this?
So I can speak to conferences. I'm not sure if conferences are in writing in the regulation. This has been an ongoing discussion, I feel like, over the past decade.
Yeah.
We really did shift to, and it's not required, it's more like scheduled.
Right.
Scheduled, scheduled, offered.
Teachers side,
Yeah.
right.
Right. Teachers are correct.
Whether they show up or not.
Yeah.
Right, the teachers must participate in conference days at the elementary and the middle school level, but not at the high school level. And that was because we got tremendous feedback that honestly, on those days, the building was just full of teachers. The parents were not necessarily engaging in that way. And then we moved to online grade books, learning management system, where I can go and see every assignment that's provided. I can see how my child's doing. People are emailing, people are texting even. So it just did not seem appropriate that we would take up some of the 180 days for high school students with conference blocks. So that's why we are where we are. I'm not sure if conferences are called out.
So there is a regulation, it's 500-13, that speaks to interim report procedures. And it addresses, that teachers are encouraged to maintain contact with parents and provide interim progress reports. It does not specifically reference conferences at any level, but I think that's where it would fall as a mechanism for providing the interim progress report.
And candidly, that conversation about what the board wants to do in the way of offering those conference days comes through your calendar discussion. Because
But it's
this
not
just-
articulated anywhere in policy or regulation.
No.
It's kind of a standard operating procedure coming
It
off
is.
of calendar.
Correct.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't necessarily, I guess there was this discussion, or there is like you said, kind of the rumor mill that, teachers aren't required to, at the high school level to, open up a time to speak with parents, basically, or designate a time to speak with parents. And there was, feedback that I've received that it is important that, maybe even more important at a high school level, that this contact happen, and especially with now the new blueprint regulations and career and college readiness and all the stuff, that there are changes that are being made to how, the requirements for graduation. So I think that I don't know how to speak to that in a policy, or whether you speak to that in a regulation.
I think that's what
That's my
interim-
question. you
Yeah,
know?
that's what I appreciate that because it is important in high school. I have 2 high schoolers myself. It's very important that there's ongoing communication. Interim progress reporting is required by every one of their teachers. The counseling record that's done on a routine basis is communication with the family. That gets more at are you meeting your requirements? Are you meeting your credits?
Right, right.
There are multiple nights per school year that all of our high schools do to talk about what are the requirements and required communication that has to go home if the child's not meeting those requirements. So I do think that some of it's in reg, and I think some of it is just in our standard procedures and expectations.
Yeah. So I don't know how this will, how my colleagues feel about this, but would you feel that it would be appropriate to have a statement in the policy? I think about who reads the policy, who goes to the policy to understand what's going on in the school system or how these systems work or what the requirement is of the school, is to speak to the encouragement of the parents to communicate with their teachers. And I don't know how that is to be, stated, but, I certainly would want to send a message as a board member for the parents to stay engaged at every level of their child's education. Whether they do or not is on them, but
I'm just trying to think about how we articulate that engagement is always available.
yeah.
Because I look at that as an expectation. I mean, and I can always, hard to believe I'm 9 years out of this now, but when my kids were in high school, I never had a problem, and I was an engaged parent, but I never had a problem when I reached out to one of my kids and said, I'd like to get together and talk to you about this. And
Yeah.
they were always available. I understand that if we put something in policy or regulation, regretfully, we're butting our heads up against negotiation and hours of day and, you need to meet with me at 5 o'clock. And that's not the teacher's workday as negotiated. We always met with them during planning period or their lunch period, but they were always very accommodating. I mean, I would have that as an expectation that if a teacher is contacted by a parent and the parent wants to meet to discuss the situation, they would make themselves available. But I don't know how we would articulate that.
I think it would certainly be appropriate to include in a policy that it is the board's expectation that school-based staff are available. You find a way to make themselves available to parents, and we, I'm not articulating it the way I would write it, but we could certainly come up with some kind of a statement that it is the board's interest that happen, and that points to the interim report procedures regulation, which hasn't been updated since 2017. So it's going to be, coming around for change too.
And I hear Ms. Allen saying that there's an expectation of our board for parents to stay engaged. And,
Right,
and,
right.
and we have some language like that in our calendar handbook
Mhm.
where we talk about the role of the parent in the education,
Yeah.
in the education of their child.
Yeah, it's
So
almost
we
like
might be
we
able to-
encourage parent engagement. Just
Right, we value and encourage.
There is, if you go back to the policy statement, it does talk about the homeschool partnership being crucial for student success and the ways parents may engage. And so maybe we even just
Break that out into its own standalone paragraph.
that policy statement a little bit
I
to
like that.
encourage both the parental involvement and make it clear that on the educator side, they're available.
And it does say parents wishing to discuss their child's progress are encouraged. So, maybe the board encourages parents to stay engaged through regular communication or frequent, I don't know.
I mean, it does say it right there.
Yeah, it says parents wishing to discuss their child's progress are encouraged to contact the school for an appointment with the teacher, counselor, or principal.
That's pretty clear.
Yeah. I
That's
feel
pretty,
I feel invited as a parent to do that.
Yeah.
But maybe it'll help just to break it out into its own paragraph so
Yeah.
it stands alone and is highlighted by the fact that it's not buried in the middle of the
Like,
paragraph.
please, you are invited in,
Yeah, I agree.
come join us. Yes.
I do want to say that parents that regularly monitor the electronic gradebook are often, likely to reach out if they see anything amiss. And so that tool has certainly, created conversation. Now, reaching out is typically by email, but there still is a communication that's going on.
This morning, I was talking with my son about some missed assignments that I saw in the online thing. And I said, I'm going to reach out to your respective teachers today to find out what the status is, because he says he turned them in and they haven't been graded. I'd like to understand why. So yes, I mean,
Way to call them out publicly.
absolutely. Hey, I didn't say the name. I didn't say the school. It's not one of our schools.
Sometimes they're on paper and it takes time to get it back.
No, I get it. I'm not 100% certain that he actually turned in the assignment.
You're also calling him out. You're also
Yes,
calling him out.
I call him out all the time, Mr. Rose.
I think that's a question.
Can you gauge or do you collect the data on parent engagement? Like how many parents have tapped into that dashboard or that grading, the electronic grade book? I mean, is there a way
So
that you monitor that?
in one of our old KPIs, we did report fill rates at conferences, and they did check Schoology hits, find out first hits, all of that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I'm a little bit passionate about parent engagement and keeping parents engaged in the school system. So I think anything we can do to encourage it, anything we can do to let kind of the public understand where this engagement level is. So, put it out there.
Yeah, well, I'm passionate about it as well. And like I remember the days. I remember it was interesting, elementary school, it was like an event.
Yes.
It was like there were snacks and the PTA put on, a little thing. And then it got less in middle school. It was just something you had to do.
Right.
And then high school, you just didn't do it unless you requested. But it's kind of an interesting dynamic to where how connected you are as an elementary school parent. And then it just, and I think that's also a good thing because it is part of responsibility as you grow as a student, being personally responsible. But I do believe parents, we certainly should encourage all the engagement we can because there's enormous data that parents, children perform better. So.
And maybe not so much from a policy perspective, but maybe as a society or as an LEH too, we can communicate that different manner of engagement as your child grows. You can still stay engaged with your school and with your teachers, but in a different way. I do not monitor. You're not going to get any Schoology hits from me because that's my kid's job. Like my mom would ask, "Did you have homework?" I'd say, "Guys, do you guys have homework? Did you get it done? How's it going?" That's that. Maybe a midterm I might look, maybe, but probably not. Because that's my expectation, but that's mine, and every parent is totally different. Some parents look every day, and I get that too. But I think maybe we, not policy discussion, but your engagement. We're desperately trying to get parents to come into the high schools because it's a not drop-off birthday party. Like we just need support in different ways. Teachers have you guys. They have the kids. We've got to support the staff so that they can do their job. And it's a different thing at the high school level.
Yeah.
And that's hard to communicate.
Yeah. But maybe if we take that, like you had already suggested, if we take that sentence, maybe wordsmith it a little bit as well, and then make it its own standalone paragraph. I think that is a good statement by the board.
Don't want to overcomplicate that.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to-
No,
But the sentence is already there. If we just
Right.
wordsmith it a little bit, like you said, make it its own.
I don't think that would be overcomplicating it at all. So if there is nothing else on this policy, the only question is, do you want to see it again before we submit it to the board, or with the proposed edits, we send it up for first reading? Okay. All right, so that brings us to the next policy. Policy 428, contests and activities, non-FCPS affiliated. And this is another relatively short one. The only real changes to the policy, other than applying the template, are we added a few definitions. We clarified that it is educational contests, and we inserted the related regulation. It's a relatively straightforward set of changes.
I don't think so. I will, full disclosure here, I did not read the regulations. I'll reserve comment.
It was last touched in 21, so it's in the context of our policies and regulations, it's fairly recent. But I mean,
Like now.
yeah.
So current.
Matter of fact, and I think the definitions that we added were pulled out of the regulation. I think they're just there to be consistent with the two.
And even the regulation is very straightforward.
It's real-
Page and less.
It's a relatively straightforward one. So I gather the consensus is, I'm sorry?
Is this a frequent occurrence?
I don't know how often we have these.
I'm thinking like, what is it, like a spelling bee or right, stuff like that.
So we definitely come through our office, but we don't hear much about it. I don't know how frequently it happens, but.
So,
Yep.
but it's there, so move it forward to the board.
Yes, please.
Okay. The next policy is our guest speaker policy. This is another relatively brief policy. The edits are, I wouldn't say they're more extensive because it's still only a page and a half. We've relocated the existing policy purpose into the policy statement, and then just articulated what the purpose is, and that is to establish, that we support the use of guest speakers. There are no definitions that staff felt was necessary. What was in policy purpose is now C1. What was in C2 is now moved into the implementation section. And so there's really not a significant amount of change. The one thing that is added is D3. This is a new statement, and that is that guest speakers invited to address a controversial issue must do so in compliance with the board's policy on controversial issues, making sure that there is a clear articulation that if you're coming to talk about something that might, raise some ears, that you're doing it the right way and you're doing it the way the board expects you to do it. And then the insertion, as we have been, of the related information to help provide more context. It was last updated in 2020.
So for the regulation, I just wanted to open that for a minute. I did have a question, but it might be answered by looking at the regulation
Sure.
itself. Is there any, I'll go ahead and ask it, is there any parent approval process for particular subjects? If they're controversial or if they're outside of the standard curriculum that is being offered in the classroom for instruction?
So I will add also to my list that we need to make all of these links because it doesn't look like they are.
Yeah, you can't. I had to go to search. Go the long way.
Yeah, so we'll make those links. Without having opened it up and looking at them, and since I don't want to spend the time to go through the long way, I don't know the answer whether there is a parental role in that. To my directors in the back.
Typically, the principal would have to approve it. I believe that's part of the reg, but there's not a permission slip. Every time, I don't believe, where a guest speaker, parents would have to sign off on that. Usually the teacher would request the principal would would then make a decision on approval. I believe that.
Okay, I feel like there needs to be parental notification for guest speakers. I feel that that's important for parents to understand that there is somebody from outside of the school system that is speaking to the student.
So I guess the question, I think we have to, that the board, not we, and the policy committee have to decide is that parental notification does that live in the generic guest speaker policy, or does that live in the teaching of potential controversial issues policy, which is, the cross-reference, if you're going to do these, if you're going to teach the controversial issues, here are the steps you have to do. And then within those steps, does the notification live there? I mean, I think it can live in either. I think it could live in both. I think it's really up to you all to decide where you want that to live.
I think there's also a challenge though so there might be guest speakers coming in, not under the policy of controversial issues, but in the course of the discussion, there might be controversial issues that come up or things that come up that aren't necessarily a part of the planned discussion and so how this is not necessarily aligned with the parental permission, but just how we're monitoring and ensuring that there's alignment with the curriculum. And I see Mr. Murphy has come up.
You're welcome.
I was poised to jump into this.
Yes, you're welcome to come on up.
So, and just thinking of an example of, so you might have local elected officials come in to speak to a government class or a history class, not with the intention to have a discussion of politics, but the political process, right? But in that discussion, that might come up. And so what's the role of our teachers and educators in ensuring that the content of the presentation is aligned with the curriculum and doesn't veer off into one of these other areas?
Yeah, what I was going to add was exactly that beyond the regulation about teaching controversial subject matter, there's also a guidance document that's given to schools that, as well as some training opportunities that helps teachers prepare. And so there's the what do I as the teacher need to do to prepare, and there's the how do I help my students prepare if I know as the teacher that a controversial discussion may arise. And part of that guidance is to loop in the parents as appropriate. It's not a directive to do it every single time, but teachers are certainly encouraged to contact parents based on context, based on the subject matter, based on an example of a guest speaker that's, in a political climate during an election year, those kinds of things, that, based on the variables, teachers are encouraged to do that in the guidance, not necessarily the reg.
So the reference to the regulation is 300-12. That's the actual regulation number. I think in the policy right now, it states that it is
432-01. So in the process of reviewing the guest speaker regulation, we renumbered it to align it with policy 432. And that's one of the things that we've been working on is, so our policies and regs were numbered using different numbering structures. And so regulations that supported a policy would not be anywhere near it. By realigning the numbers, when you search in the database, you will see 432 and then 432.01 should fall right below it. And so the policies and regulations then are, visually together. And so that's why you see it here as 432.01, because we just made that change.
So what I'm hearing is there's guidance given to the teacher and staff in regards to guest speakers, but how are parents, is there anything, we're not required, at this point, teachers are not required to notify parents of a guest speaker, or the school or administrators are not required to.
Not in the reg or the guidance, it's more best practice.
One thing, if I may add, our group did take a look at the forms that are completed when a school wants to have a guest speaker. And we have actually revised those forms to collect a lot more information. So in the past, we didn't know how many, if it was a guest speaker, we didn't know how many students were going to be impacted. Sometimes somebody comes and talks to one class. Sometimes they're coming for assemblies and they're in front of hundreds of students. So now we collect how many students will be impacted. Also in the past, we didn't collect the materials in advance. Our new procedure is going to require that we see those materials in advance. And actually a staff member has to sign off as the person who's reviewed the materials to ensure that they're accurate and that they are, bias resistant and appropriate and developmentally appropriate for the audience. The teacher has to sign off that it connects to the curriculum. Like, we're not doing this just to do this. It's tied to specific either school improvement goals or the curriculum. And then on top of that, we have a person has to be identified on the school staff to be in the room the entire time. Now, most of the time it's the teacher, but we're collecting a name now. So if you're the person bringing in the guest speaker, there's also somebody who says, I will be in the room the entire time. There's someone who's signing off that I've reviewed all of the materials that were shared in advance. And then the process goes to the principal for final approval. So we've added lots of layers of review on, who's coming in to speak to our kids, how is it connected to school improvement or the curriculum, and what materials are they sharing. And another layer that we added is also that the guest speaker has been informed that, of the expectations for handling topics that are controversial, handling topics in an age-appropriate manner. It's one thing if you're talking to, elementary school kids versus seniors in like a FCC dual enrollment class. So again, we've added all of these additional checkpoints and sign-offs, and then we still have the principal be the final review. So I think that really cleans up and gives us a lot more information about who's coming in to talk to the kids and why, and how does it connect to their learning.
I appreciate that.
In the regulation.
And so we just had the meeting. I feel like it was this week. It might have been towards the end of last week.
It was last Wednesday that
That's
we
where it
had
will
the,
live.
That's where it will live. So that form has been updated. It's in the process of going through the edits to make it look right and get updated. But all of the steps I just talked about were agreed on and will be in the form.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, that's great information, because that was, because you've answered my question about the notice going out to the actual speaker,
Mhm.
almost like, congratulations, you've been approved, but here's some guidance for you.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's right.
so thank you for that. I think that's really important.
So where are we falling with respect to including a statement about parental notification?
I will let that sit
Okay.
right now.
Okay.
I appreciate the fact that you increased kind of the vetting process
Mhm.
Mhm.
for guest speakers. So,
Because I think if anywhere, that would live under the teaching of potentially controversial issues.
the parental consent
Yeah.
type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Yes,
that's
I
where
agree,
that
I
would live.
agree with that.
Yeah.
And while we're still a little ways away from the 500 series, we've got some work still to do in the 400 series, but it is the next one up.
Yeah.
So it's not too far down the road.
Yeah.
So then,
Yeah, that'll be a great discussion.
advance this to the board then? Is that the consensus I'm getting?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the
Thank you all
additional
for all
input.
the additional, yes, that's 100%.
All right, so the next one is policy 500. This is here for a technical amendment. As we were reviewing the regulations, we realized that we used the word regulation in the definition, of course, and should have used policy. So we are presenting that as a technical change. And then I think there's, just some capitalizing of some letters, adding in some of the related information, none of which are substantive changes. These are all technical amendments that would require only a single reading by the board once the policy committee approves the technical amendments.
And this has been before the board, correct?
Correct. Yes, and just recently,
Yes.
Yeah.
just recently. So I have egg on my face for not catching that. But you read things over and over and over again, and sometimes you just don't see those kinds of things, right?
Like the approved
Yep.
it in February. Okay, so with these technical, it just goes into.
Yeah. It will go to the board for, I will be presenting, here is the technical amendment changes. It is not substantive. We're fixing a word. Yes, all of that stuff. And then the board will most likely review it, approve it, and one reading only. All right, so then that brings us to our last and maybe our most exciting policy. It is a new policy 501. When I submitted the agenda, I had library material selection as the title, but I did indicate that was a working title. So it's the title is actually selection and approval of library media materials. Mr. Murphy is here to talk us through what the new policy what we're proposing for the new policy.
Good morning, everyone. Subbing in for Dr. Cuppet, who's homesick this morning. So I'm gonna do my best to walk through this and queue up a conversation with you. Also wanted to point out that parallel work is underway with regulation. And so obviously part of our conversation today is what is in board policy and what is delegated to the superintendent through a regulation. So just wanted to point that out at the outset, that certainly that work is happening as well with an accompanying regulation. But walking through, you're aware of the purpose as a new policy to govern the selection and approval of library media materials with some definitions of what they are that include not only books, but periodicals, digital videos, and reference materials, as well as materials already in use has a definition there. I have a policy statement that's been drafted for the board in terms of the high level goals here with the policy, as well as some guidance for implementation, that library materials would support the curriculum, would empower students and provide access to diverse collection, and be accessible to all students.
Mr. Murphy, let me just jump in real quick. Policy statements C2 and C3 derive from the recently enacted Freedom to Read Act. It was passed by the legislature in April, signed by the governor, and the implementation was immediate. It was not a delayed implementation on the law. And so the language you see in C2 and C3 is pulled out of that statute to reflect that our policy is consistent with what the legislature has established. Back to you.
Thank you. Going on to number 2 under implementation, just emphasizing that FCPS will not be exclusionary or have an intent to remove materials because of any specific interests, as well as explicit alignment to policy 117. So A through D there, you'll see as familiar language from policy 117 to govern library media selection. And then number 4, as I said, directing the superintendent to establish a regulation for the process of selection and approval, as well as reconsideration, as you know. This would be a new regulation as well, as we've talked about in previous discussion, that currently many of the specific procedures for library media currently are in a standard operating procedure, not necessarily regulation. So as I said, there's parallel work underway to codify all of that in a regulation that we can certainly talk about some of the concepts that would be within the reg. So that's a summary of where we are, not only with this policy, but also a regulation that once the policy is approved, will be ready to go shortly after that.
So the one other thing I'll add, you'll in the reference section or in the additional materials section, the statute itself, that is the Freedom to Read Act, is not referenced. It will be submitted as a technical amendment, or if in the course of the process that we go through to approve the policy. The legislature actually passed 4 or 5 laws, all with the same education code section, because it is a brand new section in the code. And so they have to reconcile which one is going to be numbered which one. And so until they do that, I didn't want to create any confusion about it. And matter of fact, if you go to the Maryland General Assembly website and you look for the statute itself, you won't find it yet, which tells me that they haven't figured out yet which of the laws they enacted that they said was going to be, I think it's 4-112 or 4-412, something like that. They haven't figured out yet which one it's going to be. So we'll update the policy to make that direct reference once it's available to us.
And the other piece, just wanted to point out, in terms of our operations as a district, is beginning in the fall, we will be implementing the option of parents being able to select specific titles to opt their child out of. Or not, basically in the software, it's called a prohibited list. So essentially, parent can prohibit that book being checked out to their child beginning in the fall system-wide.
That's on the online catalog.
Yes.
So I'm sure you guys are very well aware that I probably have a lot to say about this, this policy. Personally, I would rewrite the whole thing, but I'm not going to go there. I'll let most of this stand as is. I feel like this reads a little bit like I had stated in the discipline policy, kind of ideological. It's more of kind of where we stand in our beliefs and so forth. I think we need to be much more, we need to be more concrete in our expectations of what our library materials are and what goes into our libraries in the public school system. Under definitions for library media materials, I would like to see some language incorporated about the teacher's use of media materials in the classroom and instruction. So I'm not sure how that language would play out, but I would like to see that there is at least a reference to teachers using, something that speaks to teachers using media materials in the classroom for instructional support and curriculum. Media materials already in use. I think that is pretty clear about that, but and I'm not sure how that language would play out, basically, whether it would be materials already in use by teachers in the classroom for instructional purposes. I just think we need to be clearer about where those media materials will be used. That are either already in use or available to the teacher in the classroom. Thank you for that reference point about the freedom to read and why that language is in there. I would like to see that tightened up a little bit. I feel that a statement just basically number 3 pretty much states where we are. I'm not so sure that we need the other 2, but number 3, and I feel like I'm monopolizing here. So if anybody wants to
Well,
step in.
I have a follow-up question for you, just so I make sure the definition for library media materials, your note to staff was that to incorporate a statement about the teacher's use of the library media materials is because so, and please, Mr. Murphy, correct me if I'm wrong. The library media materials is what's available to students to take out because that's what they have an interest in, as opposed to being a part of the curriculum. But I've not been in a classroom in that way, so I don't know. Maybe teachers are using the library center materials as a part of the curriculum. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so there is a bit of an overlap there. If there's an example with which the board has approved a textbook, for example, that is in the library collection, but also used in the classroom, it's sort of serving dual purposes there. In the event that a teacher would want to use a book from the library in the classroom, in that case, currently, students would need to be provided a choice. If not that book, then another book or an alternative. That's an example of some specific language that's being drafted for the regulation, a section, use of library materials in classrooms.
Okay.
So
Then
then,
that reside like in a different, almost like policy 500, which is approval of curriculum and instructional materials. Doesn't that reside, because this is just specifically about approval of library materials.
Yeah.
How we bring in library materials, not necessarily how, that's another policy about
Mhm.
approval and how they're used in the classroom.
so
So I'm like looking at policy 500 where it kind of,
I think what I would suggest then is instead of changing the definition, maybe we include in the direction to the superintendent that the regulation in support of this policy address teacher use of library materials. That way the board is signaling that this is something that they, are interested in and are paying attention to, but it's still being left to the superintendent to articulate how that's going to be done. Would that meet your interest?
Repeat what you just said in terms of where.
I would say maybe put it in D4 where we list what the superintendent is directed to create a regulation to do. Selection and approval of library media materials, process for the removal of library media materials. And then I would add a third statement there addressing how library media materials may be used in the curriculum. And it doesn't necessarily have to live in, maybe that lives in the regulation that supports 500 as opposed to the regulation that supports 501.
just cross-reference.
Right. But then staff and the superintendent can figure out where that piece fits, but the board is still articulating that it's important to you to know that we've addressed how staff or how teachers will use the materials. Does that make sense?
It does. So, but I have a question then. So we're talking about materials already in use, okay? The purpose of that statement is to indicate what?
Because there's the process for reviewing new materials is necessarily going to be different than the process for reviewing existing materials. And so I think that's why we need that definition to articulate one versus the other. And that process lives in the regulation. Yes.
So then I would make sure that, I would like to give a direction that is very clear in the regulations too.
Well, and it's also, that definition is the same definition that was used in 500.
Yeah.
The materials are
Well,
already.
500 speaks specifically to curriculum and instruction. It did include some media materials, but we're now separating those out. Is that correct? Or is 500 still going to include media materials, a reference to media materials?
When it comes to materials in use, already in use, it would be everything.
Okay.
Whether it's an approved textbook or a library material, that there's a definition of materials already in use. And there are, as you know, regulations that provide staff with expectations for how those are reviewed or reconsidered.
Right.
So
The other example about materials in classrooms is a read aloud in an elementary classroom. And so again, these are things that would have been in guidance and standard operating procedures that we envision now with the regulation.
But just one clarification on something I said earlier. I pointed to C2 and C3 as the material that came out of the Freedom to Read Act, and it's actually D2, the implementation paragraph. I got my notes crossed. So apologize for that confusion.
Gotcha. I mean, it makes a lot of sense when you read D2.
Yeah.
So. And some other comments that again, to refresh me on, like, if I wanted to provide, or if we as a committee wanted to provide direction to the superintendent, then how is that done? Is it done here? We just give that to you verbally and you carry that forward? Or is it something that needs needs to be done in writing, from the committee to the superintendent?
So, and we take robust notes coming out of the policy committee meetings. I have my notes. I know Ms. Chesney in the back, who's the paralegal from my office, is taking her notes. And then each of the individuals who come up to support the particular policy, they're also taking notes of the feedback that we receive from the board. As we said earlier, even earlier today, the regulations do live within the authority of the superintendent. It is the policy committee and the board who gives us the what you all want, and we figure out the how. Sometimes those notes make their way into the policy itself, where it's a direction to the superintendent, create a regulation that addresses X, and you all fill in the X, and then the superintendent fills in the rest. Sometimes it's just we take the notes back that you give us and we say, you know what, you've made it clear that you're interested in this. It's not necessarily something that needs to be in the policy, but we'll take the note back to the staff who are working on that particular regulation.
I feel too that, there, in the COMAR regs, when it speaks to the purpose of a school library and a media center, there's some really good definitive, statements in there about what the purpose of the school library is. And I don't know, I'd like to see that incorporated somehow into this. I know it's referenced in there, but I just think some of that language gives the parent a real definitive of what the purpose of the media center is. I also would like to see under the under number 4, maybe some more definitives of what the board would really like to see in regulations that are established, kind of not necessarily statements about directives that have to be in the regulation, but where the board, and I'm going to say where I sit right now, the process for selection and approval of library media materials is pretty broad and pretty vague, that I think it should be more specific about what the board intention is for selection and approval.
And be more specific about what because I think it's hard for us to determine as a committee what direction we're giving, especially because this is around regulation, which is not under the purview of either the policy committee or the board. So if there are more specifics that you could give, that would be helpful for us to determine as a committee I hear what you're saying, but even what you're saying is too vague for me to know whether I'm in agreement with the direction that you're.
No, I appreciate that.
I wouldn't have been able to, based on that, I wouldn't have been able to add anything because I don't know what it is the board would want in terms of the more specifics. Are you looking for it to include a clear timeline, or that it include a cross section of stakeholders who participate? I mean, there's so many broad subjects that could be what you're looking for. I wouldn't be able to do it without getting more clear guidance from the board. And maybe that's just going to necessarily be a part of the first reading, knowing that it will end up back at policy committee to incorporate that first reading comment.
Okay, so
I just think we need to be cautious about where our role as
Yes.
board members
And
fall
I'm
in
trying not to cross
policy
that line.
creation
Yeah, I'm
versus the
trying not to-
regulation, and where our areas of expertise lie as well.
Yeah. I just feel that, so in review of this policy, so I know that we speak to, in compliance with the regulations in COMAR. But under the superintendent is directed to provide a regulation to establish a process for selection and approval of library media materials, process for removal of library media materials, and the reconsideration of library media materials currently in use. there's also, I feel, an expectation of the board that these regulations that are established will also comply with all applicable laws, state and federal laws and regulations. They will recognize that parents are primarily the decision makers, and I think that you've already spoken to that, regarding their students' access to library materials. And include a process that allows students, parents, educators, and community members to provide feedback on library materials and services. That there also needs to be terms of oversight,
Excuse me.
that's okay, supervision and compliance with those. So within that, you know, we're looking to ensure that when library materials are selected, that there's a very transparent process that's in place, not only for the public, but for parents to understand what's being housed. I think there's something that we don't address directly in any of the policies is also the classroom libraries, what's in classrooms. The only way that parents know what's in a classroom library is if they walk into the classroom. Is there, I would like to understand, or I would like to see implemented maybe a reporting process that teachers have to provide a list to the superintendent of everything that's in the classroom. That's accessible to the children. Without, you know, parents don't have, that's outside of that parental notification of the main media centers.
I wonder, and I don't know if this is out of the realm of the policy committee, but I wonder if it would be helpful, depending on what you decide to do with moving it forward. I wonder if it would be helpful for us to come back and share some, you know, fundamental concepts that would be in a regulation, that would include some of what you're talking about, that would include specific criteria for library media specialists, that would include some of these notions of transparency about how a library collection is even developed in the first place, and of how the public can see that at any time. And so we just want you, the policy committee and the board, to have some assurance of, you know, what would be under the purview of the superintendent to actually carry out.
I like that idea.
That sounds great.
Yep.
Yeah, and we could certainly come back and talk about, I mean, we're not going to we're not going to give you a draft of it. We've not typically done that, but we certainly can have, Dr.
I like
Cuppett.
I like the concept idea to help guide us
Yeah.
and keep us in our lane.
No, we can do that either as a part of the June 26th policy committee meeting, or, I mean, because the changes that we've talked about to the way the policy is currently written are not that extensive. It's just adding to the list of what will be in the regulation. We could do that as part of my presentation to the board of the new policy. I can incorporate that into that presentation so we can get this in front of the board a little bit sooner. Knowing, I think we all know and we all expect that the first reading is going to result in this coming back to the policy committee with edits. But that may help inform that discussion. And rather than have, Dr. Cuppett or Mr. Murphy have to present it first to policy and then come back and do the same presentation to the board, it may make more sense to advance this to the board and do that discussion as part of that.
I like that a lot. I like that idea.
Yeah, great. We'll
Yeah.
need to make sure we build in enough time. and make
Yeah.
sure that-
Oh,
Well, and it's a new policy,
Yeah.
right? So I think that
Yeah.
it warrants. Can you, Mr. Glibbish, just go back to the 4A, B, and whatever we're at, and in terms of updating the regulation, and reiterate back to us what you would update prior to the board meeting?
so A and B stay as they are. The only change I have at the moment is adding a C that directs the superintendent to address teacher use of library media center materials with a cross-reference to the policy 500 and the corresponding regulations. That's the only one that I have. If I missed one, let's circle back and make sure I didn't miss something that the committee's looking for.
I agree with that, but I think Ms. Allen listed a number of other areas that she would like to see
And
that I'm not necessarily.
But I
agree
was
with.
directing that more towards regulation.
yes,
Like more towards what I would like to see the superintendent include in the regulation.
that the regulation comply with law and regulations set by the state, that it provides opportunity for community feedback, that parents are the primary decision maker, that there are terms for oversight, supervision, and compliance, and transparency. So, but I had heard all of that as giving feedback to the staff as they're in the process of developing the regulation.
And I do want to, I have just one or two more things, just to speak to the language here in this policy. That we talk, there's a statement in here, it says, supports the curriculum and appeals to students' personal interest and development while fostering a lifelong love of reading and learning. I appreciate the sentiment behind that, but how do we determine what the students' personal interests are? I feel that this is,
So maybe it's more a broad range of interests rather than a.
yeah,
student's
something
personal
that,
interest.
that we look to support curriculum and materials that, appeal to, right, a wide and broad range of students and is reflective of the student body and the community in which we serve, something like that. That's just off the top of my head, but that's good.
Yeah.
Just putting it there. And then, we talk about what we're not going to include. Should we speak to what we will include? I don't know. I feel like this is more on a negative side, not a positive side. So maybe we look to say that, if you want to speak to the inclusion of materials that, represent a wide range of views. And
I think that's what paragraph D1 does. FCPS will provide a library media collection that supports the curriculum and appeals to, and we're going to change that language to support a broad range of interests, that empowers students by providing access to a diverse collection of resources. I think that gets to what you're speaking to. The more positive, here's what we want in our libraries, not here's what we don't want. But again, that D2, that comes out of the Freedom to Read Act. That's a very specific statement by the legislature that we cannot exclude materials for certain reasons.
And maybe that's all we need to say, is that we cannot exclude materials for these reasons, period. And I'm a little confused about why about number 3. What was the reasoning behind including that in the policy when we already speak to that kind of in 1 and 2?
Do you mean the entire part of under number 3?
I said entire number 3, A through D, right? Yeah. I just felt like there were already statements that spoke to the inclusion of material that were diverse, and I just didn't understand the reference specifically to this policy.
So I think, and Mr. Murphy, you can jump in if I'm misspeaking. I think that the intention there is to reaffirm the significance and importance to the board of Policy 117 and anti-racism. Our equity office has done a significant amount of work in reviewing our policies and regulations, the policies as we've been presenting them, but the regulations as a whole, to make sure that we're weaving that theme of anti-racism throughout, and that this is one of those subjects that is of such importance and such significance to the board that restating it was worth restating. Certainly, if the board or the panel disagrees, we can make whatever edits you're looking to make. But I think that was the thinking behind the inclusion of that paragraph.
I'm just wondering if we can scale that down a little bit and still say what you just said.
Maybe we could move part of it up to under number 1. So FCPS will provide a library media A, B, and then maybe C is portions of that, like referencing the board policy 117, anti-racism.
For me, this is another one of the examples that I'd prefer to leave it as is and take it to the full board, and have a
Okay.
discussion with the full board. Because I feel like when we're talking about this is the will of the board
Mhm.
to reemphasize this policy, I'd prefer not, while we have that power, I'd prefer the three of us not wield that power. I'd rather take it to the board and leave this in here and let's have a discussion about how exactly the board as a whole wants to articulate our support for policy 117.
I would not disagree. I think that's a
Okay.
good suggestion.
I've got that in my notes for action when on first reading.
And I add briefly, under D1A, I get striking the word personal maybe, but I would like to keep the word students in there because this is a student focus, it's a student's library, they can go in and get what they want to get. Obviously, they're going to choose based on their personal interests or research projects, depending on why they're there. But I think it's really important, you can say students' broad interest in development, but interest in development, I think, are a key phrase there, and also to keep the word student in because we are student focused here. So I think that to me is very important.
Because I think something key there, we're not saying appeals to a student,
Right.
it appeals to students.
Mhm.
So that's all students.
Yeah.
So that's the way I read that.
We keep that in.
Yeah, and I think where I was going with that was, we make that statement here, but there's gonna also have to be a definitive somewhere that defines how that selection is made. So how are you collecting students' interest? Or, where is it gonna lie that we define how that's determined?
Yeah, I suspect, and again, jump in, tell me if I'm wrong, but I suspect the intention there was really more towards how you suggested the revision, that our library our library materials are wide in range, that we're not narrow in focus, that we have a really wide selection. So whatever the student's personal interest might be, that there's likely to be something available to them. I don't think the intention was for us to try and figure out what the personal interests of the students are, but just to articulate that we want to have a really robust set of materials that will speak to just about everybody. I think that's kind of the intention that we were trying to get to.
Yeah, and I'll give the policy committee a little preview of a fundamental concept in the regulation is a requirement of, let's call it a collection development plan that brings in student interest in that community, that gets feedback from parents in that community, that is transparent for the public and is reviewed by peers, as part of a new regulation, for example, that would speak to, all of this.
Okay.
And that's why that conversation, having that discussion with the full board as part of the presentation of the policy, I think will really help advance this policy forward. So as of now, the changes that I have are adding the third direction to the superintendent in the regulation and adjusting D1A to away from students' personal interests and more towards students' broad range of interests. And that's right now that those are the edits. And if that's it, then I would submit this is, should be good. We can push this forward to the board.
I agree.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Murphy. Appreciate your help. And that is the last policy for today. I know at our last policy committee meeting, we had talked about trying to have revisions to the discrimination and bullying. If you recall, we had that fairly robust conversation. Just wasn't feasible. Just not ready. Going to try for June 26th. If it's not ready, then I'll let you know, but we're gonna try for it. Nope. And that's the last policy.
Thank you all. We will move on to 1.13 agenda.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Are we the first group to use the boardroom?
Yes.
Oh,
Woohoo.
the inaugural.
The inaugural
Cracked
use.
a bottle of champagne over the
I would
Oh.
bow of the.
right here.
Sparkling grape juice.
That's right.
Well, when-
We're in a school,
When Dr. Cuppet texted me about an hour and a half ago and said, I'm sick at home, but I'll cover the board meeting, I'll cover policy committee virtual. I said, we're back in person today. I'll cover that policy committee.
That's right.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate y'all.